This is Under the Lens, featuring economic research by Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. The content of this presentation is strictly the opinion of Gordon T. Long and is based on facts he feels to be accurate as a result of his research at this time. All listeners are advised to independently verify all research for market changes. The following opinions are not in any way a solicitation for business, nor should they be considered investment advice. You should always consult a registered investment advisor before making investment decisions. Now, let's join Gordon for today's show.
Good morning. It is Wednesday, September 21st, 2016. I'm Gord Long at GordonTLong.com. As is normally the case, I have a lot of charts for us to go through this morning, so therefore I will pass over some of them quickly, but leave you to examine them further at your leisure. You'll need to open your viewer to full screen viewing or you'll not be able to see some of the detail I'll be discussing. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. The purpose of the audio is to discuss key developments in those areas not specifically updated in this month's Global Macro Tipping Points Research Report document. The research document this month updates macro developments. Therefore, the slides this morning will focus on our other three areas within the GMTP report: global risk, regional, and U.S. economic developments. As I often do, I'd like to tie them together into a discussion on what are the central banks so afraid of, or at least appear to be very much concerned about. In this regard, I'd like to cover the following subject areas laid out here. Global central bank liquidity injections have never been greater, and as of this moment have surpassed all previous post-financial crisis central bank intervention. As a matter of fact, we are now pumping over $200 billion per month into the global economy, unprecedented levels. This chart, which was recently actually outdated as the UK's Bank of England announcements pushed it well over $200 billion as part of Bernanke's enrich thy neighbor doctrine to keep asset prices elevated. Collectively, this means central bank liquidity is actually close to being as high as it's been at any point post-Great Financial Crisis, even with the Fed's quantitative easing program having been halted 2 years ago. As Deutsche Bank's Jim Reed points out, it's difficult at the moment to fight the central bank in the credit market, especially in Europe and the UK, where they are a non-price sensitive buyer of the asset class. Even outside of these asset purchase programs, it's fair to say that the global policy continues to be remarkably loose. Of the main central banks, the Fed has been largely neutralized, even if they manage to add a fresh hike in September or December, and the ECB and BOJ have increased and expanded the scope of their quantitative programs, with the Bank of England recommencing theirs after a nearly 4-year break. The question is, if we accept what we are told about the post-2008 financial crisis recovery, why, after nearly 8 years, do we still need such an unprecedented level of programs and level of liquidity injections? Monetary programs which only get more aggressive, it appears, by the day. The simple truth is that the recovery is a statistical illusion. We buy it because our traditional measures of this, like the stock and the bond markets, are suggesting this is the case. In actuality, they are telling us the absolute opposite. The games that have been played to keep asset prices elevated have fooled us. Maybe we just wanted to be fooled. But as you will see in a moment, there are tens of millions of Americans who are not being fooled as they face the realities of daily life. This is most evident in the political movements that have supported such unlikely presidential candidates such as Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. What we need to fully grasp is that the chief trend around us is an ongoing, permanent, worldwide economic slowing. And when properly analyzed with valid statistics, it is in fact a contraction. The absence of this growth is defined by the employment and productivity statistics, which I'll also discuss in a moment. The charts I'm showing here as I talk are in fact much worse than they appear, as bad as they are. As is usually the case with troubled, overextended, and corrupted societies, governing officials have begun to resort to magic to prop up failing economic policies. This is why the Federal Reserve, once an obscure institution deep in the background of normal life, has become front and center, holding the rest of us literally spellbound with its incantations against the intractable ravages of debt deflation. The rackets and swindles unleashed in our futile quest to keep up appearances have disabled the financial operating system that the ruling regime depends on. It's all an illusion sustained by accounting fraud to conceal promises that simply won't be kept. All the mighty efforts of central bank authorities to borrow wealth from the future in the form of money to paper over the absence of growth will not conceal the impossibility of paying that borrowed money back. The future's revenge for these empty promises will be the disclosure that the supposed wealth is not really there, especially as represented in currency, stock shares, bonds, and instruments designed to be storage vehicles for wealth. The stocks are not worth what they pretend. The bonds will never be paid off, and the currencies will not store value. Global debt is over $200 trillion at this moment. At even a 2% annual yield, that is a bleed of $4 trillion on the global economy. The global economy is reputed to be approximate $72 trillion, which I doubt, but let's assume it is at fact $72 trillion, with a growth rate maximum of 2%. That is 2 times $72 trillion, $1.4 trillion in growth annually, which is needed to pay the $4 trillion in global debt. Beginning to see the problem? It doesn't work anymore. However, this is only another symptom. Let's work ourselves towards the cause by going through a few steps here. Let's recognize that since 2007, 1.4 million U.S. manufacturing jobs were lost, while 1.4 million waiter and bartender jobs were added. What we have is lost high-paying jobs being substituted for low-paying jobs. That is a reduced standard of living in everyone's eyes, but the government statisticians. Since the end of the financial crisis, economists, analysts, and the Federal Reserve have continued to point to the monthly employment reports as proof of the ongoing economic recovery. Even the White House has jumped on the bandwagon as the president has proudly latched onto the headlines of the longest stretch of employment gains since the 1990s. Zero Hedge, on the other hand, continuously points out, and I quote, "In the past 65 months, or nearly 5.5 years, starting with March 2010, or when the jobs recovery really kicked in, jobs for waiters and bartenders, that is food service and drinking places, has declined just once. This is statistically abnormal hit rate of nearly 99%, and one which we assume has everything to do with the BLS's charge of not so much reporting reality as finding loopholes in the goal-seeking model to report that the U.S. keeps adding over 200,000 jobs each and every month or bust." My friend Lance Roberts' report, and I quote, "This chart clearly shows that the number of birth deaths of businesses since the financial crisis have been on the decline. Yet each month, when the markets get the jobs report, we see roughly 180,000 plus jobs. Included in these reports is an adjustment by the BEA to account for the number of new businesses, that is jobs, that were birthed or created during the reporting period. This number has generally added jobs to the employment report each month. The chart shows the differential in employment gains since 2009 when removing the additions to the monthly employment number through the birth-death adjustment. Real employment gains would be roughly 5.26 million less if you actually accounted for loss of jobs correctly. Let me go through some basic statistics here, and I'm showing in this chart. We have a U.S. population of about 319 million people. We have a working age population, if you use 16 years and over, which the government does for some reason, of 253 or 254 million. We have officially employed only 152 million of those people. But if you look at it, 27 of that million of that number, 15, 7, and 22 shown in this chart are 71 million are really either part-time, self-employed, multiple jobs, or work for the government. So what we have is we have not in the labor force of 102 million people, but the government only shows 7.8 million of them are unemployed. So what are the other 94.5 million people doing? Frolicking or being subsidized in some way? Well, we get a little hint when we look at entitlements. We got 43.5 million people on food stamps, which is 17% of the households, or 21.5 million households. But we actually have other areas such as food pantries, cupboards of kindness, etc., that are delivering 46 million meals on a daily basis to this number of people. Government dependencies, which don't include Social Security and Medicare, which is looming and large, is over 100 million people. Means-tested funding is now about 21.3% of the population. Welfare in total is now about just over $1 trillion, $600 billion in Medicare and $480 billion in other. These are just absolutely staggering numbers. The percentage of Americans who say they are in the middle or upper class has fallen 10 percentage points from 61% average from 2008 to 51% today, 10%. 10% of 250 million adults in the U.S. is approximately 25 million people whose economics lives have crashed. What the media is missing is that these 25 million people are invisible in a widely reported 4.9% official U.S. unemployment rate. Let's say someone has a good middle-class job that pays $65,000 a year. That job goes away in a changing, disrupted world, and his new full-time job pays $14 an hour, or about $28,000 per year. That devastated American remains counted as full-time employed because he still has full-time work. Although with drastically reduced pay and benefits, etc., he falls out of the middle class and is invisible in the current reporting. This is getting to the crux of the reality that's going on. And we all have many, many people we know that have fallen into this category. More disastrous is the emotional toll on the person. The sudden loss of household income can cause a crash of self-esteem and dignity, leading to an environment of desperation that we haven't seen since the Great Depression, and we're seeing more and more evidence of desperation in our society. We're also seeing more and more tent cities under overpasses and in public areas off the beaten way. Millions of Americans, even if they themselves are gainfully employed in good jobs, are just 1 degree away from someone who is experiencing either unemployment, underemployment, or falling wages. As I said, we know them all. What we have to understand is that this GDP is an illusion. Goldman's Peter Oppenheimer shows something here stunning. The 10-year rolling nominal earnings growth rate has collapsed to negative 1.8% in Europe and has fallen to record lows for the global equity markets. If you're not making profits and profits are falling, it's tough to increase employment. In actual fact, the GDP number that is continuously touted to represent economic growth is absurd. It is a distorted formula that no longer makes sense. As a reminder, the GDP formula is C for consumption, I for investment, plus government spending, added to the net of exports minus imports. Very simple formula that worked, but like any formula, it has boundary conditions and can become distorted from when it was originally created and sometimes has to be modified. We haven't done that. Nominal GDP is currently $8.4 trillion at the end of second quarter. This compares to $15.5 trillion 5 years previously at the end of Q2 2011. This is $2.9 trillion increase, while entitlements or government transfer payments now total $2.5 trillion. $2.5 trillion of government payments or transfer payments. The G, that's where it's spent, has become very large and is dominated, as I said, by these transfer payments. These transfer payments are then added to the C as entitlement and welfare recipients who spend it as consumption. It's called double accounting or double dipping. But who cares if it gives the impression that GDP has a 1% growth? Clearly it's not. Clearly it's negative if you were to look at the magnitude of this distortion. And that is if you can believe how the GDP number is calculated. and especially when you get into things such as hedonics, substitutions, and imputations that is used in the CPI calculation to put it into real nominal GDP. In a healthy capitalist environment, we have this flow. Savings goes into productive assets, which goes into improving productivity, which goes into rising standard of living. I've discussed this quite extensively previously. Unfortunately, as I've written about, this is not what is presently occurring. The key here is actually productivity. We have savings when we consider corporate profits, not private individuals, which are at record levels, that is, profits. It is about how this profit is actually being employed or being used. Productivity has been steadily falling in the most developed economies for some time now. When you understand that GDP growth potential is the addition of the change in productivity plus the change in the labor force, you begin to see the compounding problem facing the developed economies. And it's getting worse at an accelerating rate. Though the previous charts were all longer-term views on productivity, we've witnessed an acceleration with the last 3 quarters all falling. The third quarterly decline, the first instance since 1979, and the last 3 quarters were the biggest plunge in productivity since 1993, thanks to a doubling of unit labor costs from an expectation of 2.1% to 4.3%. We are now seeing the results of the failed use by corporations to effectively increase productivity by the use of their profits or by the dramatic increase that they have incurred in their debt loads. It has become a game of financial engineering versus productive use of capital. This has led us to the point where central bankers are being forced to prop up the financial markets because any drawdown would be simply devastating now. We effectively have created a giant Ponzi scheme, either intentionally through greed or unwittingly due to a lack of regulatory vigilance and governing neglect. But it is where we are. As I said initially, if the world, and the U.S. specifically, has actually been experiencing an economic recovery for the past 7 years, why would 14 to 15% of all Americans be dependent on food stamps to survive? When the economy is actually growing and employment is 5%, the percentage of Americans on food stamps should be below 8%. If the government economic data was truthful, there would not be 43.5 million people living in 21.4 million households dependent on food stamps. More than 100 million Americans, as I said earlier, are now dependent on some form of federal welfare, not including Social Security and Medicare, which is growing at an alarming rate as 75 million baby boomers retire. If the economy came out of a recession in the second half of 2009, why would 6 million more Americans need to go on welfare over the last 2 years? This graphic starts to get to the real cause, and that's where I'm going here. We have massive global economic imbalance. It is evident when you consider we have dramatic inflation in the U.S. on products and services we create. It isn't because Americans aren't smart or aren't working hard, because truly they are. It is the result of unsound money practices regarding money and credit creation. The products we import are actually falling in this graphic, and this is a result of a dramatically and artificially overvalued U.S. dollar. These are two separate issues. They are linked, and I've discussed this previously. My macro analytics guest, Michael Snyder, writes in a paper, From Industrial Economy to Paper Economy, The Stunning Decline of Manufacturing in America, and I quote him, "In order to maintain a sustainable economy, you have got to have people creating and producing things of value. A debt-based paper economy may seem to work for a while, but eventually the whole thing inevitably comes crashing down when faith in the paper is lost. The total number of government employees in the United States exceeds the total number of manufacturing employees by almost 10 million people. Government employees in the United States outnumber manufacturing employees by 9.9 million, according to data released by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Federal, state, and local government employed 22.2 million people in August, while the manufacturing sector employed 12.2 million. That is, the people who actually pay our bills by exporting products. The BLS has published seasonally adjusted month-by-month employment data for both government and manufacturing going back to 1939. For half a century, From January 1939 through July 1989, manufacturing employment always exceeded government employment in the United States, according to these numbers. Though you might be thinking that government jobs are good jobs, the truth is they don't produce wealth. Government employees are really good at pushing paper around and telling other people what to do, but in most instances they don't actually make anything. I'm not trying to pick on government employees or the need for them. It's the distortions that are coming into the system, are firmly in the system. Back in 1960, 24% of all Americans worked in manufacturing. Today that number has shriveled all the way down to just 8%. CNN calls it the Great Shift. In 1960, about 1 in 4 Americans had a job in manufacturing. Today, fewer than 1 in 10 are employed in the sector, according to government data. Call it the Great Shift. Workers transitioned from the fields to the factories. Now they are moving from factories to service counters and healthcare centers. The fastest growing jobs in America are now nurses, personal care aides, cooks, waiters, retail salesperson, and operations managers. All low-paying jobs, by the way. No wonder the middle class is shrinking so rapidly. There aren't too many cooks, waiters, or retail salespersons that can any longer support a middle-class family life. Since the turn of the century, we have lost more than 50,000 manufacturing facilities. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of gleaming new factories have been erected in places like China, India, Mexico, etc. Bridgewater's Ray Dalio just said here recently, and I quote him, "We have reached the limits of central banks' ability to stimulate the economy and raise global asset prices. There's only so much you can squeeze out of a debt cycle. We're there. You can't lower interest rates materially, and you are also at the limit on quantitative easing because spreads are limited. Globally, those forces that were behind us no longer are there. We're at the end of the debt cycle, and everybody will have a lower growth rate than we are used to. What I'm contending, at least Ray Dalio says, is that there are limits to spending growth financed by a combination of debt and money. When these limits are reached, it marks the end of the upward phase of the long-term debt cycle." In 1935, this scenario was dubbed pushing on a string. This scenario reflects the reduced ability of the world's reserves, currency, central banks to be effective at easing when both interest rates can't be lowered and the risk premia are too low to have quantitative easing be effective. What we have, if you really think about it, is the fact that we are now consuming more than we produce versus producing more than we consume. That's not a play on words. It's a massive shift. Our society is not built to consume more than we produce for a significant period of time. What happens and what tells you you're reaching the end is when you start getting less for more versus what capitalism is about getting more for less because of competitive pressures. We're not seeing that today. Competition is actually manifesting itself where we're getting a lot less for more. I was just reading about apartment spaces in New York City, not just how expensive they are, but how small they're getting. And this is a consistent trend in grocery stores everywhere. It shows you when they can't increase prices anymore because people can't afford anything more, you get less for the same amount of money, but much less. What is really at the core, if we keep drilling down here, we have unfortunately and misdirected ourselves. We are skewing innovation. That is, it is being targeted primarily at cost savings versus new industries. If you really think about it, everything we're doing today is reducing costs. It's not creating brand new industries. And if we are creating new industries, they're really industries that are destroying older industries that reduce cost. They're shifting employment and thereby reducing employment, but they're not creating massive growth. Because if you really look at this chart here, Vanderbilt created railroads which just changed America, the face of America. Rockefeller and oil changed the world. Andrew Carnegie and steel changed the face of American cities. Thomas Edison changed everybody's home. Henry Ford changed the way we moved in transportation. These giants took unparalleled risk, and out of it grew industries measured in the millions. Who's doing that today? We have a lack of corporate risk-taking. That's the problem today. We have professional managers versus visionaries. Steve Jobs was a genius. Warren Buffett is a genius. But Steve Jobs created jobs because he took and thought of things that nobody else had thought of, and it exploded. Warren Buffett, as brilliant as he is really about value at risk. Even he says that he's good at capital allocation. Steve Jobs' vision was that he wanted to make it a better world. We're not taking risk, we're just reducing costs. So where are the hundreds of millions of new jobs that we have to create? World Bank is saying we need to create between 600 million and a billion new jobs in the next decade, as we go from 7.3 billion people in the world to 8.2 billion, and more people are looking for jobs. Where are they going to come from? There are three serious metrics that need to be turned around, or we'll lose the whole U.S. middle class. One, according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the percentage of the total U.S. adult population that has a full-time job has been hovering around 48% since 2010. This is the lowest full-time employment level since 1983. The number of publicly listed companies trading on U.S. exchanges has been cut almost in half in the past 20 years, from about 7,300 to 3,700. Because firms can't grow organically, that is, build more businesses from new and existing customers. They give up and pay high prices to acquire their competitors, reduce costs. That's drastically shrinking the number of U.S. public companies. This seriously contributes to the massive loss of U.S. middle-class jobs. New business startups are at historical lows. Americans have stopped starting businesses, and the businesses that do start are growing at historically slow rates. Free enterprise is in a free fall, but it is fixable. Small businesses can save America and restore the middle class. The Gallup Group finds that small business startups plus shoot-ups that grow big are the engine of new economic energy. According to the U.S. Small Business Administration, 65% of all new jobs historically are created by small businesses, not large ones. I think we all know that. But here's the crisis. The death of small businesses recently outnumbered the birth of small businesses. The U.S. Bureau reports that the total number of business startups and business closures per year crossed for the first time in 2008. In the nearly 30 years before that, the U.S. consistently averaged a surplus of almost 120,000 more business births than deaths each year. But from 2008 to 2011, an average of 420,000 businesses were born annually, while an average of 450,000 per year were dying. The answer to our question of what are the central banks so scared of is that, and I surmise, they see that the global economic system is going to collapse under its own weight, and there is nothing they can do about it except to try to desperately kick the can down the road by continuing with policies grounded in extend and pretend. Our political leaders have failed us, which is quite clear if you had the stomach to follow the 2016 U.S. presidential race. Is it intractable? Is it unfixable? No. But it takes visionary leadership. It takes major risk-taking. It can't be just the status quo. It's going to take government policy that's enacted that's going to foster new business, allow regulation, take regulations get it out of the way to harness the intellectual property that comes from the general population. Right now we have it crimped and we're in a death spiral. And if we keep at it, the central banks have every right to be worried. In closing, I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there has seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following through on what has traditionally been true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2016 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family, and I thank you for listening.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.